What if the waitress everyone wanted fired turned out to be the only family an Arab billionaire had left? "Get her away from Mr. Al-Mansouri, now!" The manager's furious voice sliced through the luxury restaurant as dozens of wealthy guests turned to stare. Clara Whitmore froze. Her hands were trembling. Her cheap uniform was stained from hours of non-stop work, and standing only a few feet away from her was Zain Al-Mansouri, the cold-hearted billionaire CEO famous for firing employees without warning. Around the room, people whispered nervously, because every waitress in Chicago knew one thing about Zain. He never let the same waitress serve him twice. But before Clara could step away, a small voice suddenly echoed through the silent restaurant. "Mom?" A little boy in a soaked red jacket stood near the entrance, breathing hard from the rain, and the moment Zain saw the gold symbol hanging from the child's neck, his face turned completely pale, because it belonged to a family that had disappeared 20 years ago. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story might change the way you see people forever. Chicago glittered differently at night. From the outside, the city looked alive with beauty. Golden lights reflecting against wet pavement, luxury cars sliding through downtown streets, towering buildings glowing beneath the cold November sky. But inside the Crown Meridian Hotel, beauty came with fear, especially tonight. "Move faster," Richard Bell barked as he stormed across the restaurant floor. "Every table needs to be perfect before 9. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," several waitresses answered nervously. The entire restaurant moved like a machine under pressure. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath giant chandeliers. Expensive jazz floated softly through hidden speakers. Wealthy guests in designer suits and evening gowns filled the dining hall with quiet conversations and fake smiles. But the employees weren't focused on the customers. They were focused on the rumor. Someone important was coming tonight. Someone powerful enough to destroy careers with a single sentence. Richard straightened his tie and lowered his voice. "Listen carefully," he warned the staff. "Our mystery guest personally owns over 40 luxury properties across America. If anything goes wrong tonight, I'll make sure the person responsible never works in this city again." The room fell silent. One waitress swallowed hard. "Is it really him?" Richard didn't answer immediately, but his expression said enough. Zain Al-Mansouri. Even among billionaires, the name carried weight. The Arab CEO rarely appeared in public, but stories about him spread everywhere. Employees whispered about luxury managers fired during dinner service, executives removed from positions in front of entire boardrooms. One hotel director allegedly lost his job because a guest waited 3 extra minutes for dessert. Cold, demanding, untouchable. That was how the world described Zain Al-Mansouri. Richard clapped his hands sharply. "Now get back to work!" Across the room, Clara Whitmore hurried through the employee entrance, breathing heavily from exhaustion. Rainwater dripped from her old coat. Her blonde hair was still messy from the wind outside, and dark circles rested beneath her tired blue eyes. She was late. Again. Richard spotted her instantly. His face darkened. "Well," he said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Look who decided to show up." Clara lowered her head. "I'm sorry. The bus. I don't care about your excuses." Chun. She tightened her grip around her bag. "My son had another hospital appointment this morning. I tried to call, and somehow your personal problems become mine?" Several employees looked away awkwardly. Clara felt her cheeks burn. Humiliation had become familiar over the last 2 years. Ever since medical bills swallowed her savings, life had turned into an endless cycle of survival. Morning hospital visits, double shifts, sleepless nights beside Noah's bed listening to the weak sound of his breathing. 5-year-old Noah Whitmore was the only reason she kept going, even when she felt like collapsing. Richard stepped closer. "You're lucky tonight is busy," he hissed. "Otherwise I would have fired you already." "I need this job," Clara whispered. Richard smirked coldly. "Then stop acting like the world owes you sympathy." Before Clara could answer, another waitress approached nervously. "Richard," the young woman whispered, "VIP table 7 requested a private server." Richard turned immediately, and then slowly smiled. Not kindly, cruelly. "Perfect." Clara's stomach tightened. She already knew that look. Richard pointed directly at her. "You'll handle table 7 tonight." The room went silent again. One waitress nearly dropped a tray. "Are you serious?" Another employee muttered softly. "She's dead." Clara frowned. "What's wrong with table 7? Nobody answered. Richard adjusted his cuffs. "Our mystery guest requested a different waitress for every course. Since you're already close to losing your job, you might as well make yourself useful." Fear crept into Clara's chest. Something felt wrong. Very wrong, but she had no choice. The bills sitting inside her apartment drawer didn't care about fear. Neither did the hospital. Richard shoved a silver tray into her hands. "And Clara?" She looked up carefully. "If you embarrass this restaurant tonight," he said quietly, "I'll personally make sure no one ever hires you again." The words hit harder than she expected, because Richard knew exactly what unemployment would mean for her. No insurance, no medication, no surgery for Noah. Clara nodded silently and walked toward the kitchen. Inside, steam filled the air while chefs shouted orders over the noise of sizzling pans. She leaned against the counter for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. "You okay?" asked an older cook named Marcus. Clara forced a weak smile. "I'll survive." Marcus studied her tired face. "You should be home resting." She almost laughed. Resting. The word sounded unreal now. "I can rest when Noah gets better," she said softly. Marcus handed her a plate carefully arranged with expensive seafood and vegetables worth more than most people spent on groceries in a week. "Good luck," he muttered. Clara took the plate carefully. As she stepped back into the dining hall, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The conversations lowered. The music seemed quieter. Even the staff straightened nervously, because at that exact moment, a tall man entered through the front doors. Black tailored coat, sharp dark eyes, calm expression colder than winter itself. Zayn al-Mansouri had arrived. 2 security guards followed behind him, but he barely acknowledged anyone around him. Guests immediately recognized him. Some whispered excitedly. Others sat straighter, desperate to impress him. But Zayn looked completely uninterested. As if nothing inside the restaurant mattered, Richard rushed forward with a nervous smile. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, welcome back to the Crown Meridian. It's an honor to—" "Table," Zayn interrupted flatly. "Of course, sir. Right this way." The entire room watched him cross the restaurant like a king entering his palace. Untouchable, emotionless, powerful enough to ruin lives without effort. And somehow, Clara was the waitress assigned to serve him. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached table 7. Richard leaned close as she passed him and whispered, "Don't mess this up." Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward the billionaire sitting beneath the chandelier. For the first time, Zayn looked directly at her, and something about his stare made the air feel heavy. Not angry, not impressed, just cold enough to make her heart pound. Then his gaze shifted downward, toward the old gold necklace hanging beneath Clara's collar. For the first time that night, Zayn al-Mansouri's expression changed, only slightly, but enough to make Clara stop breathing, because the billionaire suddenly looked at her like he had seen a ghost. For several long seconds, Zayn al-Mansouri said nothing. His dark eyes remained fixed on the gold necklace resting against Clara Whitmore's neck, and the silence around table 7 became almost unbearable. Clara swallowed nervously. "Sir, your dinner." Zane slowly lifted his gaze back to her face, cold, unreadable. Whatever emotion had flashed through his eyes only moments earlier disappeared completely. He leaned back in his chair. "You're late." Clara blinked softly. "I'm sorry?" "My food," he said flatly. "It should have arrived 3 minutes ago." Her cheeks flushed immediately. "I apologize, sir." Around them, nearby guests pretended not to stare while secretly listening to every word. Everyone in the restaurant knew Zane's reputation. One mistake could end a career. Clara carefully placed the plate in front of him. "Can I bring you anything else?" Zane didn't touch the food. Instead, he studied her with unsettling focus. "Where did you get that necklace?" The question caught her off guard. Instinctively, her fingers moved toward the old gold pendant hanging beneath her uniform collar. "Oh," she said softly, "it belonged to my mother." "Your real mother?" Clara hesitated. That hesitation alone was enough for Zane to notice. "My adoptive mother gave it to me before she passed away," Clara admitted quietly. "She told me it originally belonged to someone else, but..." Zane's expression darkened slightly. Before he could respond, Richard Bell suddenly appeared beside the table, wearing a fake smile. "Is everything satisfactory, Mr. Al-Mansouri?" Zane's attention shifted away from Clara instantly. "For now." Richard laughed nervously. "Excellent. We only hire the best." Clara lowered her eyes. The lie stung more than it should have. Because Richard treated her like garbage every single day. As soon as he noticed the tray trembling slightly in Clara's hands, his smile vanished. "Careful," he warned under his breath, "or you'll embarrass yourself again." Clara quietly stepped back from the table. But before she could leave, a sharp female voice suddenly interrupted. "Oh my God!" Several heads turned. Vanessa Crawford sat at the neighboring VIP table, staring openly at Clara with disgust. Vanessa was wealthy, famous, and cruel enough to enjoy humiliating people weaker than herself. She pointed toward Clara's sleeve. "Is that a stain?" Clara instinctively looked down. A small white mark from Noah's medicine earlier that morning still remained near her wrist. Vanessa leaned back dramatically. "Richard, seriously? You allow waitresses to serve guests looking like that?" The room grew quieter. Richard immediately straightened. "I sincerely apologize, Miss Crawford." Vanessa wrinkled her nose. "She looks exhausted. Honestly, it ruins the atmosphere." Clara felt every eye in the restaurant slowly turning toward her. Embarrassment burned through her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Vanessa wasn't finished. "And those shoes," she laughed softly. "Did she walk here from a shelter?" A few guests chuckled quietly. Clara's fingers tightened around the tray. Not because of anger, because she was trying not to cry. Across the room, one young waitress looked horrified, but nobody dared defend Clara. Nobody except Marcus, the older cook watching from the kitchen doorway. "She's one of the hardest workers here," he muttered angrily. But Richard ignored him completely. "I'll handle this," the manager assured Vanessa quickly. Then he turned toward Clara with cold eyes. "Clean yourself up," he snapped. "Now." Clara nodded silently and started to leave. "Wait." The voice came from Zane. The entire room froze again. Even Richard looked nervous. Zane finally picked up his glass without looking at anyone. "She hasn't taken my order for the second course yet." Vanessa looked annoyed. "Surely another waitress can do it." Zane took a slow sip of water. "I didn't ask for another waitress." Clara stared at him in confusion. Only minutes earlier, he had looked ready to fire her himself. Now he was defending her? Richard forced another smile. "Of course, sir. Clara slowly stepped back toward the table. Zane spoke without emotion. "What's tonight's chef recommendation?" She cleared her throat carefully. Black truffle fillet with roasted garlic potatoes and red wine sauce. Do you recommend it? The question surprised her. Most wealthy guests never cared what she thought. But Clara answered honestly. No, sir. Richard nearly choked behind her. Vanessa laughed sharply. Excuse me? Clara immediately regretted speaking, but Zane's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. Why not? The sauce sits too heavy on the steak, Clara admitted quietly. The herb salmon is better tonight. The silence became painful. Richard looked seconds away from fainting. Employees weren't supposed to criticize the menu, especially not in front of Zayn al-Mansouri. Vanessa scoffed. A waitress giving culinary advice now? How adorable. But unexpectedly, Zayn closed the menu completely. I'll take the salmon. Richard's face turned pale. Clara blinked in shock. For the first time that evening, something almost invisible shifted in Zayn's expression. Not warmth, but curiosity. As Clara turned toward the kitchen, another waitress suddenly rushed past her carrying wine. The young employee slipped slightly on the polished floor. The wineglass crashed directly against Zayn's table. Red liquid splashed across the white tablecloth. Gasps filled the restaurant. The young waitress looked ready to collapse from fear. I'm sorry, she stammered. Richard exploded instantly. Are you insane? He shouted. Do you have any idea what you just did? The girl burst into tears. Please don't fire me. It wasn't her fault. Everyone turned toward Clara. Without hesitation, she stepped between Richard and the terrified waitress. I bumped into her, Clara lied softly. It was my mistake. The younger waitress stared at her in disbelief. Richard looked furious. Then maybe both of you should leave. Clara lowered her head. If someone needs to be blamed, blame me. Nearby guests whispered quietly. Nobody expected someone barely surviving herself to protect another employee, especially not at the risk of losing her own job. Zayn watched the entire scene carefully. Every second. Every reaction. Every word. And something about Clara's behavior unsettled him deeply. Because after years surrounded by fake smiles and greedy people, kindness without self-interest no longer looked real to him. Yet Clara stood there trembling with humiliation while protecting someone else. Vanessa rolled her eyes. This place gets more pathetic every minute. Then suddenly, she grabbed her wineglass and deliberately tipped it forward. Dark red wine poured directly across Clara's uniform. The restaurant gasped. Vanessa smirked coldly. Oops. For a moment, nobody moved. Wine dripped slowly from Clara's sleeves onto the marble floor. Her breathing became shaky. Humiliation wrapped around her like ice. And then Richard said the words that finally made the entire room uncomfortable. Kneel down, he ordered. Clara looked at him silently. Richard pointed toward the floor. Clean it. Right now. Even the music suddenly felt too quiet. Slowly, with dozens of wealthy strangers watching her, Clara lowered herself onto her knees. And across the room, Zayn al-Mansouri's face slowly hardened into something dangerous. The restaurant remained painfully silent as Clara Whitmore knelt on the marble floor. Wine soaked through her uniform, while the red stain spread slowly beneath her trembling hands. Nobody moved to help her. Not the wealthy guests, not the staff, not even Richard Bell. The manager simply stood there with his arms crossed, watching her humiliation like it was part of the evening entertainment. Vanessa Crawford lifted her glass with a satisfied smile. Honestly, she said loudly, some people should know where they belong. A few nervous guests laughed quietly. Clara kept her eyes lowered. Years ago, something like this would have broken her, but life had already broken her in worse ways. Hospital bills, eviction notices, watching Noah struggle to breathe in the middle of the night. Compared to those things, embarrassment almost felt small. Still, her hands shook as she wiped the floor. Across the room, Zayn al-Mansouri watched every second in complete silence. His jaw tightened slightly. Something about the scene bothered him more than he expected. Not because he cared about public embarrassment. The corporate world he ruled was filled with ruthless people. Weakness was punished everywhere. But Clara's expression unsettled him. She wasn't angry, wasn't defensive. She looked exhausted, like someone too tired to fight anymore. Richard finally snapped his fingers impatiently. "Enough," he muttered. "Get cleaned up before you scare away the customers." Clara stood slowly. Wine dripped from the sleeves of her cheap uniform onto the polished floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. Vanessa laughed softly. Does she know any other words? Before Clara could respond, her phone suddenly vibrated inside her apron pocket. Her face changed instantly when she saw the hospital number. Fear. Pure fear. "Answering calls during service now?" Richard snapped. Clara ignored him and answered immediately. "Hello?" The restaurant noise faded around her as panic filled her eyes. "What do you mean his fever is getting worse?" Zayn's attention shifted toward her immediately. On the other end of the line, the nurse spoke quickly. "We're trying to stabilize him, Ms. Whitmore, but Noah keeps asking for you. He's becoming distressed." Clara pressed her hand against her forehead. "I'll come as soon as I can." Richard stepped closer. "No, you won't." She looked at him in disbelief. "We're understaffed," Richard hissed. "You leave now, don't bother coming back." The words hit her like a slap. "But my son, your personal problems are not this restaurant's responsibility." Several employees looked horrified. Marcus muttered angrily from the kitchen doorway. "The kid's sick, Richard." The manager ignored him completely. Clara's voice cracked slightly. "Please, I just need 30 minutes. "No." The answer came instantly. Cold. Final. For a moment, Clara looked like she might collapse. Then slowly, she lowered her phone. Because she already knew the truth. Without this job, Noah's surgery would never happen. And without surgery, her chest tightened painfully. Across the room, Zayn studied her carefully. Something old and unpleasant stirred in his memory. A hospital hallway, a woman crying, a child disappearing forever. He pushed the thought away immediately. "Your salmon, sir." The sound of Clara's voice pulled him back to the present. Despite everything, she had returned to serve him. Zayn looked at the plate silently before speaking. "Your son is sick." It wasn't a question. Clara nodded carefully. "Yes, sir. And yet you stayed." She forced a faint smile. "Some people don't really have a choice." For the first time all evening, Zayn had no immediate response, because he understood that sentence better than she realized. People believed billionaires controlled everything, but power came with its own prisons, its own losses, its own ghosts. Clara carefully placed the food down. As she leaned slightly forward, the gold necklace slipped from beneath her collar completely. The pendant caught the chandelier light, and the moment Zayn saw it clearly, his face changed. Completely. The room around him seemed to disappear, because the symbol engraved into the old gold pendant was impossible. A crescent moon wrapped around a tiny rose, the private emblem of the al-Mansouri family, not the public company logo, not something sold or copied. Only direct blood relatives ever carried that symbol. Zayn's eyes darkened. "Where," he said slowly, "did you get that necklace?" Clara instinctively touched it again. "My mother left it for me." "Your mother's name?" The intensity in his voice startled her. "Eleanor Whitmore." A strange flicker crossed Zane's expression. "No," he said quietly. "Before her." Clara froze. Almost nobody knew Eleanor wasn't her biological mother. "How did you know?" "Answer the question." His voice remained calm, but underneath it, something dangerous had begun to surface. Clara hesitated. "I don't know." Zane stared at her. "She never told you?" "She said my real mother died in an accident when I was a baby." At those words, something in Zane's face hardened instantly. Accident. The exact same lie his family had been told 20 years earlier. Before he could speak again, Richard suddenly appeared beside the table, visibly nervous. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," he interrupted quickly, "I sincerely apologize if this employee has made you uncomfortable." Zane didn't look away from Clara. "How long has she worked here?" Richard blinked. "About 3 years. And you kept her serving tables like this?" Richard forced a laugh. "She's lucky we hired her at all." The moment the words left his mouth, Zane finally turned toward him. The temperature around the table seemed to drop instantly. Richard's smile faltered, because the billionaire's stare no longer looked indifferent. It looked calculating, dangerously calculating. Clara sensed the tension immediately. "I should get back to work," she whispered softly. Zane looked at her necklace one final time, then gave a small nod. As Clara walked away, Richard quickly followed her toward the hallway near the kitchen. The second they disappeared from the dining room, his expression transformed completely. "What did you tell him?" he hissed. Clara frowned. "Nothing." Richard grabbed her arm hard enough to hurt. "Don't lie to me." She pulled back in shock. "You're hurting me." But Richard looked terrified now. Not angry, terrified. His eyes darted toward the dining hall where Zane still sat watching them from across the room. Then Richard lowered his voice. "If he finds out who you really are," he whispered harshly, "everything falls apart." Clara's heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" But Richard released her immediately and stepped back, as if he had already said too much. Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone and walked quickly toward the rear exit. A few seconds later, standing alone in the dark alley behind the restaurant, Richard made a call with shaking hands. And when the person finally answered, he whispered only one sentence. He noticed the necklace. Rain hammered against the windows of the Crown Meridian Hotel as tension spread quietly through the restaurant. Inside the dark alley behind the building, Richard Bell lowered his phone with trembling hands. His breathing looked uneven now. Panicked. For years he had convinced himself the truth would stay buried forever. But the moment Zain al-Mansouri recognized that necklace, everything began slipping out of control. Richard shoved the phone back into his pocket and forced himself to calm down before returning inside. By the time he stepped back into the restaurant, Clara Whitmore was already carrying another tray toward table 7. Her hands still shook slightly. Not because of the humiliation anymore, because of Noah. Every second that passed felt dangerous now. She kept checking her phone between orders, praying the hospital wouldn't call again. Across the dining hall, wealthy guests continued eating expensive meals beneath crystal chandeliers, as if nothing serious existed beyond those walls. But Clara's entire world sat inside a hospital room several miles away, and her little boy was alone. "Table 12 needs water," Richard snapped as he passed her. Clara nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. And stop checking your phone. My son is sick. I don't care." The words were sharp enough to make nearby employees uncomfortable. Marcus slammed a pan down loudly in the kitchen. "The kid could be dying, Richard." Richard glared at him. "Mind your business." Clara quietly moved toward table 12. Her body felt heavier with every step. Exhaustion wrapped around her like chains. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in weeks. Noah's condition had worsened recently, and every hospital visit ended the same way. More tests, more medication, more bills she couldn't afford. A few minutes later, another vibration came from her apron pocket. Clara froze instantly. Hospital again. Her heart pounded as she answered. "Hello?" The nurse sounded stressed this time. "Ms. Whitmore, Noah isn't here anymore." The tray nearly slipped from Clara's hands. What? He disappeared from the waiting area while another patient was being transferred. The room around Clara blurred. He what? We already contacted security. But Clara was no longer listening. Panic exploded through her chest. "Noah!" she cried instinctively, loud enough for nearby guests to turn. Richard stormed toward her immediately. "What are you doing?" "My son is gone," Clara whispered in horror. The color drained from her face completely. "He left the hospital." For a moment, even Richard looked stunned. Then his expression hardened again. "Finish your shift." Clara stared at him like she had misheard. "My child is missing." "And you still work here?" Tears filled her eyes instantly. "Please." Richard crossed his arms. "You walk out now. You're fired." The words crushed the last bit of strength she had left. Around them, customers whispered uncomfortably. Some looked disturbed. Others simply annoyed by the interruption. Vanessa Crawford sighed dramatically from her table. "Can someone remove her already? This is depressing." Clara wiped her eyes quickly. Humiliation burned through her again. But underneath it now was terror. Pure terror. She imagined Noah alone in the cold Chicago rain. Weak, sick, scared. And suddenly, a deep voice interrupted the tension. "Enough." The entire room turned toward Zain al-Mansouri. He slowly set down his glass, dark eyes fixed directly on Richard. "You're refusing to let a mother search for her missing child?" Richard immediately straightened. "Mr. al-Mansouri, I was only trying to maintain professionalism." "Professionalism?" Zain's voice remained calm, but somehow colder than before. Richard swallowed hard. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Clara quietly whispered, "I can finish after I find him. Please." Zain studied her face carefully. Even now, she was still begging to keep her job. Not demanding sympathy, not creating drama. Just terrified of losing the only income standing between her son and death. Something about that reality unsettled him deeply. Before he could respond, the restaurant doors suddenly burst open. Cold wind swept through the dining hall, and standing there beneath the rain was a small boy wearing a soaked red jacket. The entire room fell silent. Noah Whitmore stood frozen near the entrance, breathing hard. His blonde hair clung wetly to his forehead, tiny sneakers soaked from walking through puddles, and in his small arms, he carried a folded piece of paper. "Mom," he whispered weakly. Clara gasped. "Noah!" She dropped the tray instantly and ran toward him. The little boy nearly collapsed into her arms. "You shouldn't be outside," she cried, holding him tightly. "What were you thinking?" Noah's breathing sounded strained from the cold air. "I wanted to find you." The words shattered something inside her. Several guests stared uncomfortably. Vanessa looked disgusted. "Why is there a child wandering into a luxury restaurant?" "Probably another homeless situation," someone muttered nearby. Clara ignored them completely. She touched Noah's pale face with shaking hands. "You're freezing." The boy looked up weakly. "The nurse said you were working." Tears filled Clara's eyes again. "I'm so sorry." Then suddenly, Noah's attention shifted past her shoulder, toward Zane. The little boy became strangely quiet, his blue eyes locked onto the billionaire sitting across the room. And for reasons Clara couldn't explain, Noah slowly pulled the folded paper from his jacket. "I drew this," he whispered. Before Clara could stop him, Noah walked directly toward table 7. The restaurant watched in stunned silence. Even Richard looked nervous now. Children weren't supposed to approach guests, especially not Zayn al-Mansouri, but Noah stopped beside the billionaire's table and carefully handed him the drawing. Zayn frowned slightly before unfolding it. The second he saw the image, his face changed instantly. The paper showed a childlike drawing of 3 things: a tall Arab man, a gold crescent symbol, and an enormous estate near a lake. Zayn's breathing slowed, because the drawing looked exactly like the al-Mansouri family estate outside Chicago. The same estate connected to the night his sister disappeared 20 years earlier. "How did you draw this?" he asked quietly. Noah pointed toward Clara. "My grandma had an old picture." Clara froze. "What picture?" Noah looked confused. "The one in the box under your bed." Fear slowly spread through Clara's chest, because she had never shown Noah anything like that. Zayn looked back down at the drawing, then toward the necklace around Clara's neck, and finally, toward the terrified expression on Richard Bell's face. The billionaire's eyes darkened immediately, because for the first time that night, he realized this might not be a coincidence at all. Then Noah asked the question that made the entire restaurant stop breathing. "Why do you look exactly like the man in my grandma's picture?" The restaurant went completely silent. Noah's small voice still echoed beneath the chandeliers. "Why do you look exactly like the man in my grandma's picture?" Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Clara Whitmore felt panic spread through her entire body as she rushed toward her son. "Noah," she whispered urgently, "that's enough." But the little boy looked confused. "I'm telling the truth." Zayn al-Mansouri slowly lowered the drawing onto the table. His face had become unreadable again, dangerously unreadable. "Take your son home." "Take?" Richard Bell interrupted quickly, his voice tense. "Now." Clara immediately noticed something strange. Richard wasn't angry anymore. He looked terrified. The billionaire's dark eyes shifted toward him instantly. "Why are you nervous, Mr. Bell?" Richard froze. I'm not nervous." Zayn leaned back slightly in his chair. "Then why are your hands shaking?" The manager quickly hid them behind his back. Clara looked between the 2 men, her heart pounding harder with every second. None of this made sense anymore. The necklace, the drawing, Richard's fear, and the way Zayn kept staring at her like he was trying to remember a ghost. Suddenly, Noah began coughing violently. The sound cut through the silence like broken glass. Clara dropped beside him immediately. "Noah!" The boy struggled to breathe. His small body trembled in her arms. Panic exploded across Clara's face. "No, no, no!" Marcus rushed out from the kitchen. "The kid doesn't look good." Clara touched Noah's forehead and went pale. He was burning up. Vanessa Crawford looked horrified now. "Someone call an ambulance!" But Zayn had already stood up. "Bring the car around," he ordered one of his security guards instantly. The guard nodded and disappeared without hesitation. Clara looked stunned. "You don't have to do that." Zayn ignored her completely. His attention remained fixed on Noah. "How long has he been sick?" Clara hesitated. "Since birth." "And his condition?" "Heart defect." The billionaire's jaw tightened slightly. "How long until surgery?" Tears filled Clara's eyes again. "We can't afford it." The words hung painfully in the air. Even some guests looked uncomfortable now, because for the first time that evening, The waitress they mocked no longer looked invisible. She looked human, broken, exhausted, terrified of losing the only person she loved. Noah coughed again, weaker this time. That was enough for Zane. "We're leaving," he said sharply. Richard stepped forward immediately. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, perhaps a public hospital would be more appropriate." "No." The single word silenced him instantly. Zane turned toward Clara. "My hospital." She stared at him in shock. Chicago's most expensive private medical center belonged to the Al-Mansouri family. People waited months just to enter the building. "I can't pay for that," Clara whispered. "You weren't asked to." Something about his tone made the room fall silent again. Cold, controlled. But beneath it now was something else. Urgency. Minutes later, black SUVs raced through rainy Chicago streets while Clara held Noah tightly in the back seat. The little boy rested weakly against her chest. Outside, city lights blurred through the rain-covered windows. Across from her sat Zane Al-Mansouri, silent, watching. Clara finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Why are you helping us?" Zane didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the necklace around her neck once more. "That symbol," he said quietly. "Do you know what it means?" Clara shook her head. "My mother only told me it belonged to someone important." Zane's expression darkened. "Someone important," he repeated softly, almost bitterly. Before Clara could ask anything else, the SUV stopped beneath the entrance of Al-Mansouri Medical Center. Doctors and nurses were already waiting. The moment Noah was carried inside, the building exploded into motion. Machines, voices, footsteps. Medical staff rushed the little boy down bright white hallways, while Clara followed close behind in tears. "Please, save him," she begged. "We're doing everything we can," one doctor assured her. Zane stood nearby, watching silently, and suddenly, the memory returned. 20 years earlier, another hospital, another frightened woman. His younger sister Mariam crying while holding a baby. "Promise me," she had whispered that night, "if anything happens, protect her." Zane closed his eyes briefly. The memory disappeared as quickly as it came. Because Mariam was dead. At least that was what his family had believed for 2 decades. A doctor approached moments later, holding Noah's chart. "Mr. Al-Mansouri?" Zane looked up. "We need emergency blood testing before surgery preparation." The doctor paused strangely while reviewing the file, then frowned. "That's unusual." Clara wiped tears from her face. "What?" The doctor looked between them carefully. "The boy's blood type is extremely rare." Zane's expression hardened instantly. "How rare?" The doctor hesitated. "It's a genetic variation mostly found in a few Middle Eastern family lines." Clara looked confused, but Zane went completely still, because he knew exactly what the doctor meant. The Al-Mansouri bloodline carried one of the rarest hereditary blood markers in the region. Only direct, biological relatives shared it. "That's impossible," he said quietly. The doctor frowned. "Sir?" Zane ignored him. His mind raced violently now. The necklace, the estate drawing, Mariam, the blood type, and suddenly, the impossible no longer felt impossible. Clara noticed the change immediately. "What's wrong?" Before Zane could answer, another voice interrupted from behind them. "Zane?" Everyone turned. An elderly woman stood near the hallway entrance gripping a cane, gray hair, tired eyes, and visible shock on her face. Clara gasped instantly. "Mrs. Eleanor?" The woman stared directly at the necklace around Clara's neck, then toward Zane. and all the color drained from her face. "No," she whispered weakly. Zane stepped forward slowly. "You know her." It wasn't a question. Eleanor Whitmore's hands began trembling. For several painful seconds, she looked like she might collapse completely. Then tears filled her eyes. "I prayed this day would never come." Clara stared at her in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor looked directly at Zane, and finally whispered the words that changed everything. "She's Mariam's daughter." The world seemed to stop moving. Clara froze. Zane's face turned pale for the first time in years. And down the hallway, machines suddenly began beeping wildly inside Noah's hospital room. The sound of the hospital monitors exploded through the hallway. Clara Whitmore spun around instantly. "Noah!" Doctors and nurses rushed past her toward the room, while alarms echoed against the white walls of Al-Mansouri Medical Center. For a second, Clara couldn't move. Her mind was still trapped inside Eleanor Whitmore's words. "She's Mariam's daughter." The sentence repeated over and over inside her head like a nightmare. Then survival instinct took over. Clara sprinted toward Noah's room just as medical staff pushed her back. "Please, wait outside! My son is in there! We need space to work!" Tears streamed down Clara's face as she watched doctors surround Noah's tiny body beneath bright surgical lights. The little boy looked so small against the hospital bed. Too small. Too fragile. Clara pressed both shaking hands against her mouth to stop herself from falling apart completely. Across the hallway, Zain al-Mansouri stood frozen. For years, he had trained himself never to show emotion. Not during billion-dollar negotiations, not during corporate scandals, not even at funerals. But now his entire world had begun collapsing in front of him. Mariam, his sister, not dead. A daughter hidden for 20 years. A child raised in poverty while he spent decades searching for answers. And somehow, that child had ended up serving tables in one of his restaurants. The realization felt unbearable. Eleanor lowered herself slowly into a chair, exhausted tears filling her eyes. "I never wanted this," she whispered weakly. Zane turned toward her sharply. "Start talking." His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that frightened people more than shouting ever could. Eleanor nodded slowly. "After the accident, Mariam came to me." Clara stared at her in disbelief. "What accident?" Eleanor looked heartbroken now. "The night everyone thought your mother died." The hallway fell silent except for the distant sounds of medical machines. Zane's dark eyes never left Eleanor's face. "She was terrified," the old woman continued. "She kept saying someone wanted her gone." Clara shook her head slowly. "Why would anyone want to hurt her?" Zane already knew the answer. Power, money, inheritance. The Al-Mansouri Empire had created enemies everywhere. "Who?" he asked coldly. Eleanor hesitated. "I never learned his name." Zane's jaw tightened. "But Mariam trusted one person," Eleanor whispered. "Richard Bell's father." At those words, Zane's expression darkened instantly. Clara frowned in confusion. "Richard?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "He worked security for the Al-Mansouri family years ago. Mariam believed he could help her disappear safely." A sick feeling spread through Clara's chest. "And instead?" Eleanor's voice trembled. "He sold information about her location." The hallway suddenly felt colder. Zane looked ready to break something. "She escaped before they found her," Eleanor continued. "But after that, she stopped trusting everyone." Clara struggled to breathe. Every piece of her life suddenly felt fake. "My mother was alive this whole time? For several years?" Clara's knees nearly gave out. "She raised you in secret until she became sick." Tears rolled down Eleanor's face now. "Before she died?" She begged me to protect you. From who? But deep down, Clara already knew. From anyone connected to the Al-Mansouri name. Zain closed his eyes briefly. The guilt hit him harder than expected. His own family name had terrified Mariam enough to make her hide her daughter forever. And meanwhile, Clara had spent years struggling alone while he lived surrounded by unimaginable wealth. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. One of Zain's private investigators approached quickly, holding a tablet. "Sir." Zain looked up immediately. "What is it, Agent?" The investigator's face looked tense. "You were right about Richard Bell." Clara turned sharply. "What about him?" The investigator glanced at her carefully before speaking. "We searched old financial records connected to his father." Zain's expression became dangerous. "And? There were payments. From who?" The investigator hesitated. "Anonymous offshore accounts linked to former Al-Mansouri executives." Clara stared in horror. "No!" But the worst part hadn't come yet. The investigator continued carefully. Richard Bell accessed Clara Whitmore's employment file multiple times over the last 3 years. Zain's eyes narrowed instantly. "Why?" "We don't fully know yet." The investigator swallowed nervously. "But we found something else." He turned the tablet toward Zain. An old photograph filled the screen. A younger Mariam Al-Mansouri, smiling while holding a baby. Clara stopped breathing, because the baby wore the exact same gold necklace hanging around her neck now. And standing in the background of the photo was Richard Bell's father. The hallway went silent again. Clara slowly backed away. "This can't be real." But Zain understood immediately. Richard Bell hadn't randomly humiliated Clara all these years. He knew. Maybe not everything. But enough. Enough to fear her. Enough to keep her beneath him. Poor, invisible, controlled. And suddenly Clara remembered every strange thing Richard had ever done. The way he stared at her necklace. The way he blocked promotions. The way he always found reasons to keep her desperate. "Oh my God," she whispered. Zain's face hardened completely. "He knew who you were." At that exact moment, another security guard rushed toward them. "Mr. Al-Mansouri!" "What now?" The guard looked alarmed. "Richard Bell is gone." Zain turned sharply. "What?" "He left the restaurant 20 minutes ago." The investigator checked his phone quickly. "He also emptied his apartment tonight." Clara's heart pounded violently. "He's running." "No," Zain said coldly. "He's hiding something." Then another message appeared on the investigator's screen. His face lost color instantly. "Sir." Zain grabbed the tablet. A security image filled the screen. Richard Bell inside a storage facility less than an hour earlier, carrying boxes labeled Al-Mansouri case files. Zain's expression turned deadly. Because after 20 years, the truth about Mariam's disappearance still existed somewhere, and Richard Bell had just stolen it. Before anyone could speak again, the doors to Noah's room suddenly opened. A doctor stepped into the hallway. Clara rushed forward instantly. "How is he?" The doctor removed his gloves slowly. "He's stable for now." Clara nearly collapsed in relief. But the doctor's next sentence froze everyone again. "There's something else you need to know." Zain looked at him sharply. "What?" The doctor glanced between Clara and Zain carefully. "Based on Noah's genetic markers." He hesitated. Then finally said, "There's no doubt he belongs to the Al-Mansouri bloodline." Some morning rain still covered Chicago when black SUVs stopped outside the Crown Meridian Hotel. The luxury restaurant looked exactly the same from the outside. Elegant, expensive, untouchable. But inside, everything was about to change forever. Employees whispered nervously as security guards entered first. Nobody understood why half of al-Mansouri corporate security suddenly surrounded the building before opening hours. Then Zayn al-Mansouri stepped through the front entrance, and beside him walked Clara Whitmore, the same waitress everyone had humiliated only hours earlier. The entire restaurant froze. Forks stopped moving. Voices disappeared. Even the kitchen staff slowly stepped out to stare. Clara felt every eye in the room land on her immediately. Only yesterday, she had walked through these doors feeling invisible. Today, people looked at her like she carried a secret powerful enough to destroy lives. Behind her, Noah sat quietly in a wheelchair, wrapped in a warm blanket, still weak from the hospital. Marcus rushed forward first. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Kid, you okay?" Noah smiled faintly. "Better?" "Yeah." Marcus looked relieved enough to cry. But not everyone looked relieved. At the far end of the restaurant, Vanessa Crawford stood slowly from her table. Her face tightened the second she saw Clara beside Zayn. "What is this?" Nobody answered her, because at that exact moment, two security guards dragged Richard Bell through the front doors. The room exploded with gasps. Richard's suit looked wrinkled now. Sweat covered his face, and for the first time since Clara had known him, he looked powerless. "Let me go!" he snapped angrily. The guards forced him toward the center of the dining hall. Vanessa looked horrified. "Richard?" Zayn's voice cut through the silence instantly. "Sit him down." The guards shoved Richard into a chair directly beneath the chandelier. Employees gathered carefully near the walls. Nobody dared leave. Nobody dared speak. Nobody dared. Because something enormous was happening. Clara stood beside Noah silently while fear twisted inside her chest. She still couldn't fully process the truth herself. Mariam al-Mansouri, her real mother, Zayn's sister. The billionaire slowly stepped toward Richard, dark eyes cold enough to terrify everyone in the room. "You had 20 years, Zayn said quietly. "And this is how your story ends." Richard tried forcing confidence back into his voice. "You can't prove anything." Zayn gave a small nod toward one of his investigators. Immediately, large screens around the restaurant flickered to life. Security footage began playing. The entire room watched in silence. Video after video showed Clara being humiliated over the years. Richard screaming at her, customers insulting her, Clara kneeling on the floor cleaning spilled wine, while employees watched helplessly. Marcus lowered his eyes painfully. Several waitresses looked close to tears. Vanessa's face slowly lost color, because suddenly, the poor waitress they ignored no longer looked weak. She looked abused, and everyone had allowed it to happen. Zayn finally looked toward the guests. "This woman worked in my company for 3 years." Nobody spoke. She was insulted, threatened, degraded, and treated as less than human. His voice remained calm, but rage hid underneath every word. "And none of you stopped it." The silence became unbearable. Richard suddenly laughed nervously. "You're making this emotional. She was just an employee." The second the sentence left his mouth, Zayn turned toward him with deadly stillness. "No," he said softly. "She was family." The room stopped breathing. Vanessa blinked in confusion. "What?" One of the investigators stepped forward carrying a sealed envelope. "DNA results." Zayn took the papers slowly, then looked directly at Clara. For the first time since meeting her, his expression no longer looked cold. It looked filled with regret. "Clara Whitmore," he said quietly, "is the daughter of Mariam al-Mansouri." Gasps exploded across the restaurant. One waitress covered her mouth in shock. Marcus stared at Clara in disbelief. Vanessa looked like she might faint. But Richard Bell went completely pale, because the secret he spent years hiding had finally become public. Clara's breathing turned uneven, as every face around her changed instantly. The same people who ignored her yesterday now looked terrified to even meet her eyes, and somehow, that hurt worse, because it proved how quickly the world changed when money entered the conversation. Zane continued speaking. My sister disappeared 20 years ago, after members of my family's inner circle betrayed her. Richard shouted suddenly, I didn't kill anyone! Security guards moved instantly, but Zane raised one hand calmly. Let him speak. Richard's breathing sounded ragged now. My father only followed orders. The room exploded into whispers again. Clara stared at him in horror. You knew, she whispered. Richard looked at her with desperation instead of arrogance now. I didn't know everything. But you knew enough. He lowered his eyes, and that silence became the answer. Tears filled Clara's eyes again. For years she believed her suffering was bad luck. But now she understood. Someone had intentionally kept her life small, controlled, powerless. Richard looked toward Zane desperately. You don't understand what your family was like back then. Zane's expression darkened immediately. Oh, I understand perfectly. The billionaire stepped closer. My sister begged for help. Richard said nothing. She hid her child to survive. Still silence. And while Clara worked herself nearly to death trying to save her son, Zane's voice hardened dangerously. You made her kneel on the floor in front of strangers. Richard looked away in shame. Across the room, Vanessa suddenly spoke carefully. Mr. Al-Mansouri, nobody knew who she really was. Clara looked toward her instantly, and the billionaire's answer came colder than ice. That's exactly the problem. The room fell silent again. Why, Zane continued quietly, should a woman need wealth or bloodline before people decide she deserves dignity? Nobody had an answer, because he was right. Clara deserved kindness long before anyone discovered her last name. Noah suddenly tugged softly on Clara's sleeve. Mom? She knelt beside him immediately. The little boy looked around the restaurant quietly. Why are they all scared now? Clara's heart broke. Because even a child could see the truth clearly. She touched his hair gently. Some people only respect power. Noah frowned slightly. That's sad. Several employees lowered their heads, including Marcus, including some waitresses. Even Vanessa looked ashamed. Then unexpectedly, Clara slowly stood back up and turned toward Zane. Please don't fire everyone. The entire room looked stunned. After everything that happened, she still wasn't asking for revenge. Zane stared at her carefully. They hurt you. I know. And you still want mercy? Clara looked around the restaurant, at frightened waitresses, at exhausted kitchen staff, at people trapped in the same fear she had lived with for years. Then she answered softly. Most of them were scared, too. The room fell completely silent again, because in that moment, everyone finally understood why Clara Whitmore had changed everything. And Zane Al-Mansouri realized something terrifying. After years of power, wealth, and control, the strongest person in the room had never been him. The story spread across Chicago before sunset. By the next morning, every major news station carried the same headline. Waitress discovered to be heir to Al-Mansouri family fortune. People everywhere talked about Clara Whitmore, the poor waitress who had spent years serving wealthy strangers while unknowingly carrying one of the most powerful family names in America. But inside a private hospital room at Al-Mansouri Medical Center, none of that mattered to Clara. She sat quietly beside Noah's bed, gently brushing her fingers through his blonde hair, while machines beeped softly around them. The little boy was finally sleeping peacefully. For the first time in weeks, his breathing sounded steady, and that alone felt more valuable than money. A soft knock came from the doorway. Clara looked up. Zayn al-Mansouri entered slowly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. His expensive suit remained perfectly pressed, as always, but something about him looked different now. Softer. More human. He handed her 1 cup carefully. "You haven't slept." Clara accepted it quietly. "Neither of you," when a faint smile almost appeared on his face. Almost. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt cold. Just unfamiliar. Zayn glanced toward Noah. "The doctors are optimistic." Tears immediately filled Clara's eyes again. "Really?" "They believe surgery can fully correct the condition." She lowered her head quickly, overwhelmed. For years, hope had felt dangerous, because every time she allowed herself to believe things might improve, life became cruel again. Zayn sat across from her quietly. "You spent years carrying this alone." Clara looked down at her coffee. "I didn't really have another option." The billionaire studied her carefully. His chest tightened with guilt, because while Clara struggled to survive, he had spent years surrounded by unimaginable luxury, and somehow he never noticed the missing piece of his own family living inside his company. "I failed you," he said quietly. Clara looked up immediately. "No, yes." His voice remained calm, but pain hid underneath it now. "My family created the world that hurt your mother." Clara swallowed hard. Even now, hearing the words "your mother" felt strange. Mariam al-Mansouri. A woman she never truly knew. A woman whose face she had only seen hours earlier in an old photograph. "I don't know how to feel," Clara admitted softly. "You don't need to decide today." The kindness in his voice surprised her more than anything else, because the man sitting across from her barely resembled the billionaire everyone feared inside the restaurant. A few moments later, another knock interrupted them. Marcus stepped carefully into the room, holding flowers that looked awkwardly wrapped by hand. "Well," he muttered nervously, "these looked better at the store." Clara laughed softly for the first time in days. Real laughter. Marcus visibly relaxed. "There she is." He walked toward Noah's bed and smiled sadly at the sleeping child. "How's the little guy?" "Better." "Good." Marcus hesitated before looking toward Zayn, then immediately lowered his eyes respectfully. The billionaire noticed. And for once, he hated it. Because he suddenly understood something Clara already knew. Fear and respect were not the same thing. Marcus cleared his throat awkwardly. "The staff wanted me to say something." Clara frowned slightly. "What?" "They're sorry." She looked surprised. Marcus nodded slowly. "Most of them knew Richard was cruel. He sighed heavily. "People get scared when their jobs are on the line." Clara understood that better than anyone. Still, part of her wished somebody had spoken sooner. Marcus looked toward Zayn carefully. "The restaurant feels different now." The billionaire raised an eyebrow slightly. "Different how? Nobody's terrified anymore." Silence filled the room, because everyone understood what that really meant. Later that afternoon, Zayn returned to the Crown Meridian alone. The luxury restaurant looked beautiful as always, but now he noticed things he ignored before. Exhausted employees, nervous smiles, workers apologizing for things that weren't mistakes. Fear lived inside the building, and somehow, he had helped create it. The entire staff froze the second he entered. One waitress nearly dropped a tray. Another employee looked seconds away from crying. Zane slowly looked around the room, then spoke words nobody expected. I owe all of you an apology. The silence became absolute. Employees stared at him in disbelief, because billionaires didn't apologize, especially not to waitresses and cooks. Zane continued calmly. I allowed fear to become the culture of this company. Marcus stepped forward slightly. Sir, no, Zane interrupted gently. You deserve to hear this. Yet, he looked around the restaurant again. At some point, I stopped seeing employees as people. Several workers lowered their eyes emotionally. Clara Whitmore reminded me what leadership is supposed to look like. The room remained silent, but now it felt different, not fearful, emotional. Zane then announced changes immediately. Richard Bell was officially terminated under criminal investigation. Employee medical assistance programs would begin across every Al-Mansouri property. Managers would be personally monitored for abuse of power, and no employee would ever again be punished for taking care of family emergencies. Some workers quietly began crying. One young waitress whispered, "Thank you." Zane nodded once, then finally looked toward the spot where Clara used to kneel on the floor cleaning spilled wine. The memory made his jaw tighten painfully. Never again. That evening, Vanessa Crawford arrived unexpectedly at the hospital, carrying an expensive gift basket. Clara nearly didn't recognize her. The wealthy woman looked nervous now. Uncomfortable. I wanted to apologize, Vanessa said quietly. Clara remained silent. Vanessa swallowed hard. What I did at the restaurant was cruel. Yes, Clara answered honestly. The directness clearly shocked Vanessa. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Vanessa looked down. I think I forgot how easy life has been for me. Clara studied her carefully. People only changed when they were forced to confront themselves. And maybe, for the first time, Vanessa finally had. I forgive you, Clara said softly. Vanessa looked stunned. You do? I didn't say I forgot. The wealthy woman slowly nodded, because forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. Late that night, Noah finally woke after several hours of sleep. His small eyes blinked slowly beneath the dim hospital lights. Mom? Clara rushed beside him immediately. I'm here. The little boy smiled weakly. Then his eyes shifted toward Zane, standing quietly near the window. Noah tilted his head slightly, and in the softest voice imaginable, he whispered, Grandpa? Zane froze completely. The room fell silent, and for the first time in years, the billionaire's eyes filled with tears. For a long moment, nobody inside the hospital room moved. Noah's small voice still lingered softly in the air. Grandpa? Zane Al-Mansouri stood near the window, completely frozen. The word hit him harder than any business failure, betrayal, or loss ever had. Because for 20 years he believed his family had ended the night Mariam disappeared. And now, a little boy with tired blue eyes was looking at him like family, like home. Clara watched the billionaire carefully. She had seen powerful men before. Cruel men. Proud men. Men who hid emotions behind money and status. But what she saw in Zane's face now was different. Pain. Regret. Love. All at once. Noah smiled sleepily. You look sad. A quiet laugh escaped Clara through her tears. Zane slowly walked toward the bed. I'm all right, he whispered. Noah frowned slightly. Mom says people say that when they're not all right. For the first time in years, Zane genuinely smiled. Small, fragile, but real. You're very smart, he said softly. Noah lifted his tiny shoulders proudly. I know. The room filled with gentle laughter. And somehow, after everything that happened, it felt healing. 3 weeks later, snow began falling across Chicago. The city transformed into white streets, glowing windows, and frozen rooftops beneath the winter sky. Inside the Al-Mansouri estate, outside the city, warmth finally returned to a house that had felt empty for decades. Clara stood near one of the giant windows holding a cup of tea while watching snow fall across the gardens. The estate was beautiful. Too beautiful. Massive chandeliers, marble floors, paintings worth more than entire apartment buildings. But despite the luxury surrounding her, Clara still felt like the same waitress who worked double shifts and counted grocery money carefully. She still woke up early to check Noah's medication, still folded her own laundry, still apologized when people carried things for her. Some habits didn't disappear just because life suddenly changed. Behind her, Noah ran through the hallway laughing while Marcus chased him dramatically. "I'm too old for this," Marcus shouted. Noah laughed harder. "You're slow!" The sound echoed through the mansion. Alive. Happy. Zane watched quietly from the staircase above. And every time Noah laughed, something heavy inside his chest softened a little more, because this house had once been filled with silence. Now it sounded like family again. Later that evening, Clara entered Zane's office carrying a small velvet box. The billionaire looked up from his desk. "What's that?" She walked toward him slowly and placed the box in front of him. Inside rested the old gold necklace. The crescent moon and rose symbol gleamed beneath the office lights. Zane stared at it silently. "My mother kept this hidden her entire life," Clara whispered. His expression darkened with emotion. "She was protecting you." Clara nodded softly. "I know that now." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara finally asked the question sitting inside her heart for weeks. "What was she like?" Zane leaned back slowly in his chair. And for the next hour, he told stories about Mariam sneaking desserts from the kitchen as a teenager, about her love for music, about the way she laughed during thunderstorms, because she said rain made the world feel honest. Clara listened quietly while tears filled her eyes, because for the first time in her life, her mother felt real. Not just a mystery. Not just pain. Family. Weeks later, the Crown Meridian Hotel reopened after major renovations. But the biggest changes weren't physical. The fear inside the building was gone. Employees no longer flinched when managers walked past. No one panicked over tiny mistakes. And hanging behind the front desk was a new company rule written in gold letters: respect every person equally. The grand reopening attracted media from across Chicago. Reporters filled the dining hall while cameras flashed everywhere. But the person everyone waited to hear from wasn't Zane. It was Clara Whitmore. The former waitress slowly stepped onto the small stage at the center of the restaurant. She looked nervous beneath the bright lights. But when she saw Noah smiling proudly in the front row beside Zane, her fear faded. Clara took a slow breath. "A few weeks ago," she began softly, "I knelt on this floor while people looked at me like I didn't matter." The room fell silent instantly. "I thought being poor made me invisible." Several former employees lowered their eyes emotionally, but I learned something important. Her voice trembled slightly. "Kindness matters most when someone has nothing left to give." Complete silence filled the restaurant. Clara continued slowly. "There are people all around us carrying pain we cannot see." She looked toward the employees standing near the walls. A waitress, a cleaner, A cook, a single parent trying to survive. Her eyes filled with tears. They deserve dignity before success. Several reporters stopped typing, because nobody expected words that honest. Clara smiled faintly through her emotion. The world treated me differently when they learned my last name. She glanced toward Zane briefly. But my value didn't suddenly appear because of wealth. The room became completely still. I was the same person before anyone knew who I was. For a second, nobody moved. Then applause slowly began. One person, then another, until the entire restaurant stood clapping. Not for money, not for power, for her. Zane watched silently from Noah's table, and in that moment he understood something that changed him forever. True respect could never be bought. It had to be earned through humanity. Later that night, after the reporters left and the restaurant finally emptied, Clara, Noah, and Zane sat together near the large front windows, watching snow fall quietly over Chicago. Noah yawned sleepily against Clara's shoulder. "Are we really family now?" he asked softly. Zane looked at him carefully, then gently rested one hand against the boy's hair. "Yes," he answered. "This time forever." And for the first time in many years, the billionaire no longer felt alone. Kindness can change lives in ways money never will. Never judge someone by their clothes, job, or struggles, because the people the world ignores often carry the strongest hearts. True character reveals itself in difficult moments, and respect should never depend on wealth or status. If this story touched your heart, comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotional stories like this.